Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCAST, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the newest iteration of the Climate and Coordination RCAST. We have a variety of news stories to share today with everyone. The first of which comes from a website called insurancejournal.com. Not something I was familiar with before, but I suppose everyone needs a magazine. So this is a very interesting story from March 15th, and it talks about the sort of hidden costs that are passed off to taxpayers about the climate crisis. And my second story also kind of has to do with this, but I wanted to talk about this one first because it's a little bit of a continuation of what we talked about last time. I'm just going to read a little bit from here. But if you're interested in how climate change can cost regular people all across the world, this is a great sort of beginning to that. So it says here, fallout from last month's deadly deep freeze in Texas has quietly spread to people living hundreds of miles away. Minnesota utilities have warned that monthly heating bills could spike by $400. After the crisis jacked up natural gas prices across the country, Xcel Energy's Colorado customers could face a $7.50 per month surcharge for the next 2 years. This is a subtle demonstration of the way Americans already share the collective financial burden of climate change, even when we don't realize it. The national bill for global warming is here, and it's rising. It goes on to explain a little bit more about why the taxpayers have to pay for these problems, and obviously it shouldn't be it shouldn't be their burden necessarily, but this is really affecting everyone. It goes on to also talk a little bit about the federal government's budget and spending when it comes to these problems, and so here's a little bit more. The federal government spent about $2.3 billion fighting fires last year, roughly 10 times what it spent in 1985. So that is a great figure for anybody who feels that the fires are just a continuation of normalcy. So 10 times more is not normal, I don't think. And so that money to fight the fires comes from taxes. It says here, so too does funding for the National Flood Insurance Program, something we talk about all the time, which has piled up to $20.5 billion in debt after record-setting hurricane season across the Southeast and Gulf Coast. The program now pays about $1 million in interest per day, according to a recent federal report, and won't be able to repay its existing debts in the next decade as warmer oceans bring more flooding. Just going to read one more thing here. It says, there's just no question that we're paying the costs of climate change today. This isn't something that's going to happen to polar bears in 2050. Which I just thought was funny. Kind of dark, but also kind of funny. It also goes on to talk about just the increase in climate-related disasters, which we've already talked about. And also I wanted to say one more thing about PG&E. which is California's largest utility company. There's always a big uproar about PG&E, the management of their resources and so forth, and the relationship to the fires. It says here, PG&E Corp tumbled into bankruptcy after its equipment sparked fires that killed more than 100 people and destroyed thousands of homes. The utility emerged from Chapter 11 last year, having settled claims for $25.5 billion that will be covered by the company's shareholders. California's three big investor-owned utilities could spend an estimated $40 billion on wildfire prevention over the next decade. So, a lot of these costs are going to fall on the taxpayer. It says to pay for that work, the average California utility customer will see an additional charge on their bill of $96 to $144 per year, according to the state report. By 2030, those charges will likely rise by another $30. So this is something that is going to affect everyone's bottom line. Maybe if you live in Michigan, Michigan has its own problems. I'm struggling to think of a state where these types of issues are not going to be prevalent and relevant. But the National Flood Insurance Program paying $1 million in interest per day on its debt was a staggering statistic to me. So I'd love to get anyone's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for me to kind of observe. It seems like there's a reckoning happening, there's an awakening happening, and there's going to be hopefully a shift in the idea of cost, externalities, and costs, and how to handle those costs. And I think that's kind of essentially what this article is kind of highlighting. And then, of course, too, like just the interconnectedness of everything, and it's a global problem. It's it's not one little part of the world at one particular part of time. We're all in this together, and we all have to kind of figure out how to mitigate this together, and that takes money, and figuring out how to be really smart. Governments have to figure out how to be really smart with how they spend the money.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love that you mentioned externalities, because my other story really talks about that. And this story is shocking to me and also very interesting. It's from The Guardian. It's from
before we move
20...
on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, sorry. I just wanted to make a couple of other comments, which are
please,
related,
yes, of course,
related to our discussion last week. One of the big ways that we can begin to address what you're talking about is a shift to a decentralized grid, right? So if you can imagine that, especially in California, many homes are well situated to be able to utilize solar. And if there were a grid that had a blockchain attached to it, so that people could trade power easily, right? From their home computer, they could say, "Oh, looks like we've been running the hairdryer too much. You better see if the neighbors have a little extra, and buy it." You can imagine that this is very ends up being quite profitable for individuals, and it begins to address a lot of the issues that the power companies are facing. Right, it makes people more self-sufficient and more connected to each other, while at the same time moving away from a lot of the kinds of issues that PG&E is facing. So I'm not saying it's a panacea. I mean, it's not an overall solution for all the problems, but it is a big shift in the right direction. And so, this is a practical step that we can take that is going to be more and more important as the infrastructure is threatened, not only in this way, but also because it just has to move. It can't remain on the coast. It can't remain in fire-trodden or fire-threatened regions. So having a decentralized grid also allows us to address the kind of reconfiguration that's going to happen as climate change hits. Anyway, those are my thoughts about the article you just read.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's going to be a really important topic coming up, and it would be great if we can try to find a guest. I know Darryl is working on that. I'm also working on that, trying to find a guest that can talk a little more about that kind of work.
Great.
So.
Yeah, and it's actually the other story that I was going to bring up today is completely connected to what you were just talking about, Greg. So, yeah.
Cool. So, Nora, please go on.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the second story I have before I turn it over to Darryl for his articles is this was a shocking story to me. This is from February 25th, and it's just really surprising to me. So this is about abandoned oil wells and oil rigs across the United States. And there are a lot of them. The headline is, "Who will clean up the billion-dollar mess of abandoned U.S. oil wells?" It's a lot more than $1 billion, but anyway, it's a nice headline. It is really shocking how many of these there are. I would love to know if there are any guesses about okay, so in 2018, the EPA did a report on this, and as of 2018, they cited how many abandoned wells they thought there were in the U.S. So I would love to take any guesses on this, if anyone's interested.
I'm going to guess 30, so in the thousands.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say about 3,000.
Nice. So
really low.
It says here they are by the way, this is from The Guardian. I don't know if I mentioned that. I always like to say what the source is. There are unremediated wells in Los Angeles neighborhoods and Pennsylvania farms. Of course, lots of other places than that. There could be as many as 3.2 million abandoned wells in the U.S.
Wow.
Which is a lot.
That's
I thought
incredible.
It would be like 10,
wow.
20,000, but 3.2 million is a lot.
Wow.
And how many of these?
Wow.
They said there's an estimated 2,500 abandoned oil wells in Powder River Basin alone, which is, I need to read where this is. That's in Wyoming. That's on some land in Wyoming, where drilling started there in 1889. Anyway, I'll just say a little more. So the problem with these oil wells is that there are, first off, there's a ton of them that are abandoned, right? But also they leak methane, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, potent meaning it traps heat even more effectively than carbon. So methane is really dangerous to have in the atmosphere because it's just a lot stronger than carbon, and also it's poisonous. Also, these wells obviously pose huge environmental problems. Some of them are leaking. It says here they have no liable party, usually due to the bankruptcy of certain oil companies. And it says here that oil and gas companies, there's more than 50 major companies that have gone bankrupt only in the last year. And it's probably going to accelerate with Joe Biden, President Biden, pausing drilling on federal land and other stuff. But anyway, it says here, usually due to bankruptcy or idle or abandoned wells where the company has walked away, but could still be liable. The cause of the rampant methane emissions is up to 8% in the US, according to a 2014 analysis, which means that it's probably higher now in 2021, but like we're looking at a very large portion. 8% is a real portion of methane emissions, and these wells might be, a formidable slice of that. I know 8% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's almost 1/10 of the problem. They also leak carcinogenic gases, of course. It's a precursor. Methane is a precursor for ozone. And anyway, it's just there's a lot of problems here, but basically it says here that they need to really start reinforcing who's going to clean up this stuff and what's the incentive. It says here, so many have been left uncapped because the regulations and bonding requirements, the money that companies pay ahead of time as insurance for those wells, is so minimal that it's nearly impossible to hold drillers responsible or to pay for the cleanup. Some companies simply walk away from the wells, meaning they are still liable when firms go out of business, but they are not. It says the penalties for not cleaning up a well are minimal when there's nothing but a small bond holding a company responsible. How do you convince operators to comply when there's no carrot and no stick? This means that the profits for drilling go to individual companies, while the damages, both environmental and financial, are largely borne by local, community, and state and federal taxpayers. Just what we said about the other story. Unplugged wells devalue property. They're a mess to work around and can lead to groundwater pollution, and no one is really tracking that. It says it could cost $280 billion to reclaim the wells, and public bonding data indicates that states have less than 1% of that money in bonds. So basically the onus cannot fall on the states because they don't have that kind of money. Cleanup for an individual well can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $1 million. It involves filling it with clay or concrete, covering the surface, replacing topsoil, and removing any pipes or waste like fracking fluid. Wyoming, the piece opens with a story about a place called Powder River Basin, which is really trying to fight against this and to get the over 2,000 oil wells and or rigs cleaned up there. And it says Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission upped their bonding fees, but there's still a big gap in funding. Wyoming as a whole, not just that basin, but the entire state, has 64,000, it says, orphaned and unplugged wells, which would cost about $10 billion to remediate. That's from an October report, apparently from last year. Even with the increased bonding requirements, as of most recent tally, the state has about $225 million in bonds. The Center for American Progress recently published a plan for a $2 billion orphan well cleanup, which is about 1%, they said, of the potential whole cost, which would both address the pollution and support 14,000 to 24,000 jobs in energy-producing states like Wyoming. So obviously, putting people to work to clean up this stuff would be a really great job creator, and also a wonderful public health and environmental health initiative. It says at the end here, this is a quote from Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado, who I believe ran for president in 2020. It says here, I think this is a two-step solution. First would be creating a cleanup fund to address the giant backlog of orphan wells that are scattered across the nation. Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually from the person who authored the October report. Sorry. Then the heart of the problem is that we need an adequate bonding requirements in place that allow oil and gas companies to not be able to walk away and leave taxpayers holding the bag. I love that phrase, holding the bag. Yeah, I did not realize that there were 3.2, of course this is an estimate, but around 3 million abandoned wells is a ton. I'm just really glad that the Guardian is reporting on this, because it's so easy for a huge story like this to go unnoticed. And, the final thing I'll say is just, as we are really trying to ramp up our efforts to fight climate change, and find ways to just draw down. I think that term draw down is going to be a really major term over the next few years, because like every place it's possible to take carbon out is going to be important. Like Ian was asking me last week, what can we do? Like, I think every single place we can find that's like, okay, we know, like, that's not even carbon that needs to be, like, it's not even being used. Like, it's just leaking. So that's such an obvious place. And I think the more that we clean up these places, that's going to be a huge sector of emissions reduction. It's just total waste. And again, that doesn't require any, excuse me, any lifestyle change or anything like that. That's just cleaning up garbage, basically. So I think this is going to be a major sector to watch in the future. So I'd love to get anyone's thoughts.
Well, I guess like, obviously like the big problem here is who pays for it, right? And, hindsight's 2020, like it said, the bonds should have been bigger, or, if an oil company was going to get subsidies, then that cost obviously should have been taken into account. But, externalities are something Milton Friedman said don't matter. So here we are. So I have this idea of how to pay for it, how to get the people who profited so much from this to actually come back and solve the problem after, they've gone away and wiped their hands clean.
Can't wait.
Okay, so here you go. What you do is each leaky well, you turn into a non-fungible token. And then the speculation goes wild because everybody wants to own a thick leaky well. And the very same people who profited would be like, yeah, I'm going to make so much money. I'm going to, get a piece of this action.
Very funny.
It's just so crazy. It just might work.
Yeah. Oh, well. Wow. Yeah. It's actually, I thought your take on it, Nora, was quite hopeful. You're right. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's the kind of work that is easy to do. Like, nobody's using these things, so we can just clean it up. And yes, it does need to be paid for. And probably, the major oil companies are going to have to pay reparations. But in the meantime, you're right. Rolling up our sleeves and just getting that done is that's one that's a no-brainer, right? It doesn't take a lot of policy to say, oh, we've got to clean this up.
Yeah, and I feel like in the sort of sea of climate despair that I sort of find myself floating in, sipping a margarita, looking off into the distance. I love stories like this because it's like, it's something that can be done. You know what I mean? And obviously I feel like there are a lot of other things, but like electrifying airplanes, for example, is a lot bigger of a problem. Something
Sure.
like that is a lot more difficult, I feel.
Yeah, but that's just an engineering problem. There's no policy that you have to face there. At least I don't think there is. The
Totally.
the things that to me seem like real, challenges is when you have to have a policy debate, right? Because then you've got this whole sector of Ted Cruz's who are completely checked out.
I mean, yeah, God.
Right. I mean, they're not even thinking about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really crazy. Yeah. But there is hope. So that's great. And I'm glad to see that they talked with, I think he's a Senator Michael Bennett, about that, because that means that he's aware. And hopefully we'll see some progress on this. So I'm going to try to follow this story. If there's more at a later date, I'm going to share it, because I just feel it's shocking story. Who would think there's 3 million friggin' abandoned wells? I mean, that's a lot. So
that's a lot of wells.
I know it's a lot of wells. So, okay. So I'd love to turn it over to Darryl so you can share what you have for us.
Okay. completely kind of connects to, I think, all of this stuff, particularly Greg's response to your first story, and also to what we've been talking about over the last week or so. And so this is a article about a science fiction movie. The headline is Netflix Best Sci-Fi Series of 2021 Reveals an Urgent Crisis Facing America. The year is 2074. Several decades prior, a mysterious crisis known as Black December plunged the world into a global power blackout, killing off most of humanity. The surviving humans now live in small, scattered tribes across Europe. They have no memory of the modern conveniences, running water, or even Netflix that once depended on having a stable electric grid. The post-apocalyptic series, Tribes of Europa, premiered on Netflix in February and is still available for streaming. At first glance, it might seem like the fever dream nightmare of a doomsday prepper, but is it really so far-fetched? Daniel Kirshen is a professor of power and energy systems at the University of Washington. He tells Inverse, one way we could possibly get close to this nightmarish scenario is a series of global cyber attacks. This means one country hacking into another country's electric grid, taking control and creating a blackout. Think of a nuclear arms race, but on a cyber level. You can imagine one country attacking another and the other one retaliating, and so on. In the aftermath, it would probably take a few days to put the grid back together and retake control of the grid, Kirshen says, but if heavy equipment damage occurs, then it would likely take much longer, leaving people without power for prolonged periods. The scenario is already on the minds of some experts. In 2015, former CIA Director James Woolsey testified before Congress about an eerily similar possibility. Woolsey testified that a powerful geomagnetic storm or an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, attack from an adversarial entity ranging from small battery-powered devices to nuclear warheads could wipe out the U.S. electric grid for up to 2 years. When asked by Senator Ron Johnson what would happen to society if the grid was down for that long, Woolsey made a grim prediction. There are essentially two estimates on how many people would die from hunger, from starvation, from lack of water, and from social disruption. One estimate is that within a year or so, 2/3 of the United States population would die. The other estimate is that within a year or so, 90% of the US population would die. We are talking about total devastation. We are not talking about just a regular catastrophe. Woolsey projection might seem like hyperbole, but the US government is taking it very seriously. In 2017, the Department of Homeland Security compiled a 147-page report on how to deal with the cascading damaging effects of long-term power outage. A subsequent 2020 DHS report found that EMP presents a strategic threat to the nation. What I was going to kind of ask about and talk about was, again, the idea of a decentralized energy grid, and how that could present the solution. It goes on later in the article to mention that, climate change could also, be a factor in, knocking down power for extended periods of time. And we just experienced that in Texas. So it's something that I've thought about often. It's just like how fragile we really are. Like, everyone just assumes that we're always going to have this electricity easily accessible. And, there's little moments when it goes away and we kind of go, oh, wow, we're really dependent on this. And so earlier on in the week, we were talking about with each other just on our ops calls about electrical utility co-ops. And I am just wondering whether there is a path towards working with fellow co-ops that are electric utilities to help them transition to a more decentralized approach. Like, do you think there's a path for, like, would there be resistance? If they're kind of, they're electrical utility cooperatives, but they still use kind of, I'm going to imagine, more centralized sources of AC. Do you see a path for helping these co-ops think about transitioning to a more decentralized solution, or are they already working on it? Or
well, I know that there are some people who are already working on it. I think the cooperatives represent most of the, at least in the US, they represent most of the rural regions. And I think there's a strong sentiment towards self-sufficiency. So I think there is a psychological, there's a narrative that will hook in that makes it possible to move in that direction. So yeah, technologically, I think it's a no-brainer. It's always been about, in the developed countries and even in the developing countries, it's always been about regulatory issues. So I think for the cooperatives, that's our best bet, because there's already this strong narrative for self-sufficiency, and a decentralized grid is much more about self-sufficiency. So, it's a place where, America first meets climate change, right? To put it starkly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I think I'm going to try to to take a more concerted effort to reaching out to some of these electric co-ops and just say we're here, to see if there's any interest in kind of starting a conversation.
Yeah, I think it's something that I've really wanted to get into. Just too many things on the plate, right?
Yeah. So I have a technical question. So what I'd like to ask you about is, you've been giving me the answers to the 3 questions that you posted on Twitter about a month or 2 ago. And I've got the answers for 1 and 2. And I know you've answered 3 a few times already, but I'm going to, if you don't mind, ask you one last time. If you could just explain the solution that RChain brings when confronting question 3, if that's okay.
Why don't you remind our listeners what question 3 is?
Okay. So question 3, what happens to this chain as a user-written smart contract introduces bugs? If the answer doesn't include type checking that prevents security and concurrency errors, you can pretty much conclude this chain will not support a large developer base.
Right. So what I've said before is, even if, so this is for smart contracting systems. Everything from Ethereum to Harmony, they're all of them share this characteristic, which is you could have the core protocol be perfect. It could be written by the angels, so there are no flaws. But now you open it up for those pesky humans to write smart contracts on top of the core protocol. They're going to make mistakes. They're even code which is formally verified can still be mistaken because you get the formal spec wrong. So this idea that there aren't going to be serious flaws in the smart contracts is completely fictitious. And so there are going to be certain kinds of flaws that we just can't automatically detect, and that we're going to have to find to experience. But there are a wide range of flaws that you can ask the machine to detect for you. Now, what do I mean by the machine? So it turns out that we have, over the last 30 years, been developing some very powerful technology for automatically checking code for a wide range of errors. And this is much bigger than the kinds of errors that type checking is currently used for. So today, type checking is used essentially to make sure it's like electrical standards, right? You standardize the plug and the socket. So like in Europe, you have the 3-prong plug with the big fat prongs, at least in the UK, and in Europe you have the two-pronged sort of rounded prong solution, and so you standardize on the sockets. And that prevents a whole bunch of wiring mishaps that took place in the 18 and 1900s, right? So the type checking in modern programming languages is sort of at that level. But the theory has become quite practical to type check a lot more. And I want to point something out that's very important. Programmers are juggling a lot of tasks, and the hardest thing for a programmer is the context switching. So you just concentrated for 4 hours straight to get all the balls in the air, and someone knocks on your door and says, "Hey, can I ask you about?" And all that work that you just did internally to get all the balls in the air in your mind goes poof. And so you have to retrace a lot of those steps. So that's the big challenge for programmers, and they'll all tell you this. Not the big challenge, but a big challenge. So there are a lot of different formal verification methods, and a lot of them to date were not for production code, but were for academics. So you take a toy version of what you're working on, you represent it in some theorem prover like Isabelle or Hall or whatever. You reason about it there, and then you transport the results back over to the system that you're working on. So that means that there's this big giant gap between what you just checked formally automatically and what you're actually producing. And there's also a big giant context switch. So you're writing real production code, then you stop what you're doing, you go over to a different system, you code up a toy version of what you're doing, you check that, and then you go and you get the results you want, and then you go back to what you're actually doing, right? So there's two big problems with that, and now it turns out that type checking kind of resolves both of those problems. Most programmers are used to having writing in languages that insist that their programs be type checked. So, and as I said before, right now what that's doing is just making sure the ends connect up at standard joints. So you could think of the ends of information flow pipelines connecting up in standard joints. So that's and most programmers who are producing production code are expecting the language in which they write to have a type checker, which will then at least give them that level of guarantee. And so it's a part of their daily practice. There isn't an interruption in the same way that, this kind of moving over to a different tool is an interruption. And there isn't a shift in the formalism. And then on top of that, it can be quite speedy. So the idea is you take the existing work, the last 30 years of development in type theory, you move it into a modern programming language. And that's essentially what Rolang does. So Rolang provides a language which has a very tiny surface area, but is amenable to the kind of type checking that I was talking about. So that even if programmers introduce concurrency errors such as deadlocks, or they introduce security errors where information is leaking from one community to another, information that you don't want to move from one community to another is being transmitted. Those kinds of things can be automatically detected. They can be detected in finite time. And and in the situation of the blockchain, where you have, potentially mission critical financial or other systems running on top of it, being able to prevent those kinds of flaws would save hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. I often use the Dow bug as an example because it's a very good one. All right, so $50 million out of a $150 million contract was drained because of an exploit that could have been caught by a type checker. So, and there are many, many others like that. So we're literally from the point of view of what we know from type theory, it's like people are using stone knives and bear skins to build nuclear power plants, and it's not such a good it's not a good idea. We have the tools to do this. We should be applying them. But most of the blockchains have been built by people who are well versed in cryptography or finance or game theory, but they're not well versed in these other aspects of computer science. And as a result, they don't avail themselves of these technologies that now have 30 years of vetting behind them. Did that make sense?
Yes, it's really, really helpful. It kind of did raise some more questions in my mind, though. Because I was going to ask that. You answered it just before I had a chance. But the idea that, like, why isn't anybody else, or why are there so few others kind of thinking about this? And you just answered that. And so I guess the answer to it is that it took someone with almost like a Renaissance person, multidisciplinary understanding to kind of recognize that this needed to be done. Like, there's not that many people around that have that complete grasp. And
So yeah, exactly. I mean, the truth is that there's just think about it, right? How many people on the planet really know what's going on in dark matter research, right? How many people on the planet really know what's going on in cosmology in general, or the relationship between cosmology and quantum mechanics, or blah blah blah, right? So those are all areas that sort of, even though the popular press touches on them, not very many people really understand.
Yeah, like probably a handful, like probably a handful.
Yeah. Right. So by the same token, there's a revolution going on in our understanding of what proof is. Like an absolute revolution. Like the idea of proof was completely exploded 30 years ago. And the consequences to all of mathematics and engineering are only just beginning to be felt. So this has consequences to security, so zero knowledge proofs, and complexity, so interactive proofs, and resources, linear proofs. So all of these things are slowly reaching out to from their origin, their birthplace, out to these other fields. But science is a slow process, and engineering is even slower to adopt what the science suggests. So being finding people who really for example, it's very useful to not have to worry about the production headaches, right? Because there are all kinds of production headaches. For example, in blockchain, many of the production headaches are regulatory. Right. So it's very useful as a researcher in computer science to not have to worry about regulatory issues while you're doing your research. So there are these natural silos that have to do with, I just want to focus on this one problem and get it solved. So that's useful in one sense, but it's terrible in another, because you don't see the connections between these different fields. And so there are people who have to work in terms of making connections across the fields.
I see. So if I'm understanding it right, it seems like a lot of proposed solutions for this kind of blockchain quagmire or just problem is to kind of have the I don't know if I'm using the term formal verification right, but having the solution happen off chain as a side chain is
no. It's not about
getting it right.
No. The way RChain works is you write your smart contract in Rolang, and then you submit your smart contract to execute. So the writing of the smart contract is not done on a side chain. It's just done by someone writing some text before they submit it to the blockchain. And right now, there are some kinds of checks that are being done on the smart contracts that are being executed. So in particular, we're detecting certain kinds of conflicts within amongst the smart contracts. But we could do a lot more checking before we even start executing. We could just statically analyze the code that's coming in for errors. And that static analysis could either be done at the client, where someone is writing code, or be done at the server, or both, which is the most secure of all. And it's perfectly sound and valid for someone to write some code in an editor and then, press a button and have a tool that is local to their environment check their code for properties. Right? So that's neither on chain nor side chain. It's just, before I submit this smart contract, I want to make sure it does what I want it to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then when it gets to the chain, there can be an additional set of checks.
So
does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I understand that. What I'm confused about is how other alternative blockchain altcoins, or whatever you want to call it, other layer one approaches, how they're addressing this potential problem and dealing with it.
They're not.
They're just not thinking about it. They're just not.
There's no concerted, realistic effort that I'm aware of.
I see.
So, for example, I know that Vitalik put some money into various formal methods, but they were completely misguided. They just totally missed what the point was, because Ethereum doesn't have experience with formal methods. They don't understand where to slot in the formal methods. This is as far as I can tell, it's a similar kind of issue across the industry. I mean, there may be a few out there, but most people are unaware even that these techniques exist. Like I said, how many people are actually aware of the connections between, cosmology and quantum mechanics?
Okay, so I didn't realize it's that obscure. Like, it's that kind of limited in scope as far as people who even know about this stuff.
That's right.
Cutting edge.
Yeah. Well, we're this may be a good time to close it out.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure we'll continue this conversation another time. I just wanted to make an announcement that RChain is going to be compiling some selfie videos from anybody who wishes to participate, so long as the video is appropriate, of course. Answering the question, if Earth could speak, what would she say? And you can send your responses if you're interested. Just make a selfie video of about 15 seconds, and then you just send that to climate@rchain.coop no later than April 10th, and you might be included in our Earth Day compilation on April 22nd. So that's something that's happening if anyone's interested. Thank you all so much for a great conversation today. Make sure that you're subscribed to RChain on YouTube and following the co-op on social media. And if you'd like to become a member, you can do that at rchain.coop. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.